Hello, my name is Klara Jurecic. Welcome to the webinar. I see that we already have many participants with us today, so we will start with the webinar. Good morning again. Thank you so much for joining us, and warm welcome to the webinar where we will discuss and address land concentration and land grabbing in the context of just green transition in the European Union. I'm Klara Jurecic, the moderator of this webinar and the journalist, and today I'm working with Policy Lab based here in Ljubljana. This webinar is part of the project GreenPaths of European Knowledge Hub, financed by Horizon Europe. It's a series of webinars, and we will have the next webinar already next week. And today, in this hopefully lively discussion, we are trying to get a better understanding of land grabbing and land concentration in Europe, and what implications this has for Europe and the world. And farmland concentration is a pressing issue in the European Union. Although the total area of agricultural land has remained steady over the past decade, the number of small farms has fallen significantly, with serious social and environmental consequences. So furthermore, the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, shortly CAP, has played a role in this shift by enabling the expansion of large agroholdings and the decline of small-scale farms. And additionally, agricultural land is frequently purchased by non-agricultural investors, often leading to environmental harm and food security risks, presenting major obstacles to achieving a just green transition. And this complex and broad topic will be discussed with our speakers. All three of them are researchers, and today here with us are Silvia Kay, Katarina Kosic, and Žiga Malek. Welcome. And before we start with the discussion, just a brief technical overview. All the microphones for the participants are muted. So if you want to pose a question or have any commentary for our speakers, please use the Q&A option. The last third of the webinar will be time and place for addressing those questions. So welcome. And let's start with our discussion today. Firstly, we will begin with Silvia Kay. She's a researcher. Pardon. Silvia Kay is a researcher and project coordinator at the Transnational Institute based in Amsterdam. And Silvia is also the lead author of the study on land grabbing in Europe, commissioned by the European Parliament. So to begin with a bit more broad question, land grabbing is typically associated with the global south. And however, your research has shown that it is also becoming prevalent in the European Union. Could you speak about the various actors involved in farmland grabbing in the European Union and the kind of legal and economic conditions that allow or incentivize land grabs? And the second part of the question would be, how does land grabbing differ from land concentration? Because today both are being mentioned. And why is it so important to recognize that land concentration is just one dimension on the broader issue of land grabs? Silvia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Klara. A lot to unpack there in that multi-pronged question that I was prepared. Yeah, I just want to say thank you also for the invitation and for everyone joining. And it's also a pleasure to be with Katarina and Žiga in this discussion. I should also say that Transnational Institute is a member of the GreenPaths project, so we're also happy to be involved from that perspective. Well, to respond to your question and to give perhaps a bit of contextual background, also how the Transnational Institutes got involved in this issue of land grabbing and land concentration. I mean, I think you're right to pinpoint that in the initial kind of global land rush that followed the 2008 to 2009 global feed, fuel, and financial crisis, I think you're right to say that the focus was on the global south. It was on these spectacular kind of land deals of tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of hectares in primarily in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And of course, this kind of caught the attention of the media, rightly so, because there were really egregious cases of displacement, of corruption, of bad contracts, and really the selling out of sovereignty. But at TNI, we always thought it was a bit misleading or erroneous, really, to think that Europe was somehow situated outside of that global land grab. It really was a global phenomenon. And the assumption a bit why not so much attention was focused on Europe was the assumption was a bit that, yes, Europe has strong regulatory frameworks in place. We have well-functioning land markets. We have these kind of protective mechanisms that mean that European Union, or more broadly that the pan-European region, is somehow immune to these trends. As TNI, we worked for many decades. It's part of our core mission to do participatory action research, particularly with social movement organizations and grassroots organizations. So having worked a bit with European agrarian movements and environmental activists and peasant farmers organizations, we always suspected that it was, that kind of assumption was maybe not correct. And that Europe was also very much part of this global land grabbing phenomenon, both as a source of investors acquiring land, but also as a host, as a continent that where land grabbing was also taking place. And we wanted to put that, we wanted a bit to trigger this kind of debate in Europe on land issues. And so one of the things that we did to kind of put land on the political agenda, if you will, was that in 2013, we published a book this was together with the European Coordination Via Campesina and the Hands Off the Land Alliance, where we did some original field work, some data collection work, testimonials of 13 country case studies of critical land issues across Europe. And some of those were what could be described as land grabs, which I'll get into just a bit by what we mean by that. And that indeed, as you mentioned, we were then subsequently asked to produce this official report for the European Parliament on land grabbing in the EU. The EU was increasingly forced to take up this issue, to have a reckoning that this was also an issue in Europe. And it also followed the publication of various EU reports on this topic, including, for example, a 2015 own initiative report by the European Economic and Social Committee, which was called Land Grabbing, a Warning for Europe and a Threat to Family Farming. But yeah, of course, land grabbing in Europe has its own dynamics, its own characteristics, its own particular features. It's obviously contextual. And so having done some of this research, we summarized some of the elements of those land deals that could qualify or could be considered perhaps to be this a type of land grabbing. We identified something like four kind of facets. First of all, they were kind of, and you've already alluded to this, Clara, they were land deals that were very much also associated with the rise of non-traditional actors or non-traditional investors in farmland. So they were investors, for example, from the financial sector. I'm thinking of banks, pension funds, insurance groups, specialized investment vehicles that were set up as farmland was increasingly seen as a sort of safe haven for investments and quite an attractive opportunity for a return for shareholders. So we saw that kind of new phenomenon of these new actors. They would land deals that involved a kind of extra economic and sometimes extra legal force What do I mean by this? But by this, I mean it wasn't just the ordinary workings of land markets that were producing these deals. There were kind of roles of politically connected economic elites. There were roles in terms of what we called kind of land deal brokers, kind of mediators that would mediate between an investor and the original small farmer, for example, or there could be like mayors or people that had some perhaps degree of also political and economic clout that could have this kind of intermediary role. Yeah, and they involved sometimes also shady tactics, let's say. They were out of standard European proportion, both in terms of the physical size of land acquired, whether it would be in a single land deal or by accumulating various and consolidating very smaller plots of land. So it would be outside the standard European farm size. And it would be out of standard European proportion also in terms of the scale of capital mobilized. So there were quite significant investments in terms of the capital involved. And then lastly, the last feature was that they were also then went hand in hand, and this speaks a bit to the green and just transition element of this webinar. They also, these land deals altered fundamentally the model of production and disrupted kind of socio-ecological balances when it comes to the mode of farming or the style of farming that was employed. Often it involved the sort of standardization and simplification of landscapes as opposed to more multifunctional forms of farming. I was going to give one example, but I think I might be running out of time, so I can perhaps get to that further in the discussion.
Maybe you can give an example now.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to give one example just to show this rise of this kind of phenomenon of this kind of financialization of agriculture, to really show how that's manifesting itself. So one example that T and I worked on to uncover a bit more, we worked on this together with the peasant organization Eco-Ruralis from Romania and an investigative journalist. And it was to uncover a bit the investment webs and the sort of money flows of the Rabo Farm Fund. This was a few years back. It was in the order of a sort of 200 to 300 million euro specialized institutional investment vehicle of the Dutch Rabobank, which was one of the largest is one of the largest agri-food banks in the world. And I attended one of their I attended a talk by them here in the Netherlands where they promoted activities of what they called sustainable agricultural investment and land improvement schemes in Romania. And I was quite curious about what this really was, because there weren't further details provided. And they didn't give any kind of further details of the extent of their ownership of farmland in Romania or where exactly those investments were located. And by working with this, and it wasn't also known to the national in the national register in Romania and to the national authorities. So we traced some of these investment webs and money flows of the fund. And the way that this fund operated is it worked together with this Dutch fund worked together with a domestic agricultural holding company in Romania, which then subsequently worked with at least 56 that we could uncover further subsidiary companies in the country to acquire kind of hundreds of plots of land, throughout different regions of Romania. And perhaps the most alarming case, besides the fact that the true extent of their ownership was shielded from view, was the fact that in many instances also the plots that had been acquired from villages were either sold to these subsidiary companies without their direct knowledge, so they only found out after the fact, or basically through forms of threats and intimidation. And it was just an example. It was written up in case people are interested. There's a good write-up of it in various articles in an investigative journalist magazine that really shows how, yeah, this was a case of really impropriety and in some cases also nepotism and corruption. And so that was just one example of that kind of instance in Europe. Perhaps just I wanted to make one more point, which is just to say that land grabbing is one contributor to the phenomenon, to the much more broader structural and all-encompassing phenomenon of land concentration that you mentioned. It contributes to land concentration, but the drivers of land concentration in Europe are much more numerous. It's to do with, I'm sure others might get into it, but it's to do with multiple factors that exert pressure on farmland and a much more longer term kind of crisis really in the EU's food and agricultural system, which fails to support family and peasant farmers and which undermines diversity and resilience. And just to give you an idea of the extent of this farmland concentration in Europe, across the EU member states, it's just 3% of farms that control over half of EU farmland. So it's really, quite an alarming picture of land inequality in Europe. And of course, that land inequality goes hand in hand also with inequality in access to subsidies and other kinds of farm aid schemes. So that is something also very much to pay attention to.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think there is a lot to unpack here, but we will get to it a bit later. The point you made about also farmers being intimidated, it shows that land grabbing is not just a political issue, but it affects our everyday life. And some ways of land grabs you mentioned, I think we will also heard in the future. So we are moving to Katarina now with the question. Katarina is a researcher at University of Vienna, based in Vienna, and some of Katarina's work actually focuses on political ecologies of land in Croatia and Serbia. And we will hear some examples from Serbia. So Katarina, your research on farmland grabbing has largely focused on the case of Serbia. And while Serbia is currently not a part of the European Union, it may still serve as an interesting case for looking at the way the transition from socialism to capitalism in the past decades has affected land grabbing. And could you maybe talk about land grabbing practices in Serbia and how do they relate to the legal and economic transition to capitalism? And maybe put in context if those land grabbing practices in Serbia are different, similar to the practices that Sylvia mentioned.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you very much for inviting me to the organizer, but to the whole GreenPaths project. And before answering this question, it goes really well into kind of adding detail to Sylvia's already outlined dynamics. I just have to say that these early 2013 and 2015 reports from TNI were kind of crucial in my own interest in these topics. So it's really nice to be here as a whole. So yeah, I will start with a little, even though I am not a historian, but I think the land concentration and land grabbing in East Europe requires a historical perspective always. And this is because post-war transitions, and I think more specifically privatizations, are crucial for understanding land politics. And I think this is not just the case in former Yugoslavia, but more broadly in East Europe and other post-socialist settings. What is specific about Yugoslavia, and I think this is where it differs from countries like Ukraine or Romania, that is a very well-examined example, is that Yugoslavia never collectivized its agriculture during socialism, its agricultural land. Collectivization efforts were abandoned, so large agricultural combines and enterprises function with either cooperative or socialized land. So it was social rather than state property that was very particular to Yugoslavia. And then after the wars, the privatization process was extremely urgent. Loans were conditional, aid was conditional on the privatization process. And when it came to the food industry, this was impossible to do without land, because who would buy these huge enterprises with only use rights rather than actual ownership of land? And this led to a really highly corrupt process. And some of these privatizations are actually well documented in Serbia in the Anti-Corruption Council reports. But in short, there was kind of like a double criminal activity. And first, what happened is that overnight, land that was used to be social land or collective land became state land, and this was done in order to be able to sell these enterprises. So the workers who were actually entitled to this land were damaged for the first time. But then even after the first sales, and I think this will be familiar to anyone kind of working and living in the post-socialist space, then we saw the kind of very violent extraction of value from these enterprises and many waves of reselling and reprivatizing and bankruptcies and everything else that follows. So these were kind of the two ways of changing land ownership and land use. And I think there's also, even though this background is similar in all Yugoslav states, there are also country-specific particularities. So, for example, in Croatia, during privatizations, land was not sold, but land was given in concessions, in 99-year concessions. And this is quite relevant now because one of the biggest agricultural holdings in Croatia has just been reprivatized many times, Agrokor, and the concessions are kind of sold with the company, and this is done in a kind of common sense way, even though there are some people who are questioning this process and questioning the kind of the naturalness of these concessions. This is very specific to Croatia. In Serbia, they were sold, and this led to many corrupt processes. But there in Serbia, there are also new mechanisms that further kind of make possible more land grabbing. And I think maybe the most important mechanism in the cases that I have looked at has been the bilateral agreement with the United Arab Emirates. And this is not in relation to only agriculture, but this is a wider agreement that allows large investments from the Emirates to bypass public tenders. The details of these investments, as well as their kind of progress, are mostly kept secret, and because they are officially issues of special national importance. And we have all heard about these famous cases of the Belgrade waterfront, the Serbian airlines, the defense industries. But what is maybe less familiar to people is that these also included very large investments in agriculture. And maybe, I think I do have time. Clara, please do stop me when I'm too long. I'll also maybe illustrate with a short example. And that's the most recent kind of documented in the media case, the 2018 privatization of the agricultural combine in Belgrade that was sold to Al Dahra, a company from the United Arab Emirates. And it included about 17,000 hectares of land, which is very specific because this agriculture enterprise was built as a part of Belgrade urban development. So it's a very unique kind of landscape in that it's almost integrated into the capital city. And just like other investments, these were criticized for lack of transparency, for corruption. There's a lot of investigative journalistic pieces on this because actually like Sylvia said, there are these kind of corrupt brokers, and this was a really important part of this case because the land was initially state land and not allowed to be sold. And then through this like very obscure mechanism, they turned state land into enterprise land to be able to sell it as a part of the privatization. There was a lot of debate among former employees and pensioners that still hadn't been paid for their shares that they were supposed to get, and there was a lot of debate about after the privatization about the welfare of the animals that were stayed, because a lot of this was cattle, but also about the workers' rights that remained in the company. And I think what this case of the PKB illustrates is, on the one hand, this kind of very, very complicated history where it's very difficult to differentiate between privatizations and land grabbing. And because I think in land grabbing discussions, we very often depend on kind of having a foreign investor as an actor. But to really understand land politics in post-socialist states, we also have to look at privatizations that often were not foreign actors. They were domestic actors, but in a very, very corrupt kind of process. And the other thing that I think really comes out in the case of PKB is that when we are trying to understand kind of the consequences of these deals, it becomes very difficult because the production does not always change, because these were already very large, concentrated kind of farmland. And in the case of PKB, yes, things are changing now and there is less production. But for example, in the kind of modes of production and kind of the ecological consequences, it might not be that different. But yet there are social consequences that are much more difficult to understand. And when I was doing interviews with workers in PKB, many of them told me that they have been 3 generations of their family working in PKB. And because the enterprise was built on reclaimed land it used to be swampland, they arrived from all over Yugoslavia and worked on this land. And so it's a much more kind of effective also process in abandoning this. And the second way, I think, in which these enterprises, PKB especially, but I think most enterprises in post-socialist countries, is that they are also very important actors in spatial planning. So if you look at the history of PKB, the development of the entire capital city involved PKB as an actor and as an important dimension. So it's not so easy to quantify and understand really how the sale of that kind of actor affects the city planning and the city life afterwards. So I think I would just conclude that I think especially Yugoslav space, but I would say post-socialist East in general kind of complicates these narratives of land grabbing because we don't often have what people say real peasants. They're usually peasant workers, people who work and in factories and do semi-subsistence on the side. We don't always have a kind of evil foreign investors in these spectacular deals, but we have very slow processes of privatization and post-socialist deterioration. And then the consequences are much more difficult to untangle than just production or just ownership. And I would end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina. We will come back to you. And now we are moving to Žiga Malek, researcher at Biotechnical Faculty, University of Ljubljana here in Slovenia, and also researcher at IASA in Vienna. And Žiga's area of research is focused on land use modeling. In other words, capturing different kinds of land use with remote sensing and interpreting data for assessing policy impacts. And Žiga, I would like to know, there has been a decline of small farms and family farms in the European Union, which is related to the ongoing trend of land concentration. So we are moving from land grabbing to land concentration now. In your view, what are the causes and consequences of this decline?
Yeah, it's first, thanks for inviting me and thanks everyone for participating. So I work a lot with what happens on the field, so the consequences mostly. And it's difficult to pinpoint only one thing. And I'm very happy that we have here today quite a focus on Central Eastern Europe, because what we are observing here now was perhaps happening in Western Europe, decades ago, and it's maybe not happening on such scale, although it is happening as well. So if I like to look at environmental trends in different parts of the world, and in Europe, most trends suggest that actually such concentration is not a bad thing, right? We have more and more forest, we have less and less cropland, actually, we have less pasture land, and we keep on producing more and more food, or it's static. So on one side, you could say we managed somehow to decouple the environmental impact in Europe and food production, but in reality, this is not the case. We concentrated it, as we have heard now from the 2 experts before me, but this also means, in environmental terms, this means it became more intensive. So for me, concentration also means intensification means more fertilizers used, more phytopharmaceutical measures used, so pesticides. It means larger farms in terms of having more animals in one unit. And often this is something that is close to people, and is also something we talk a lot. There is talked a lot about in the European Parliament, for example. So we don't talk so much about land consolidation, land grabbing, but we talk about pesticides. You know, there have been several cases where we try to limit the use of some pesticides because they're carcinogenic, they're deadly to bees, which are important for our food system. But in the end, this did not really materialize as we would want to. Because of this, they said it will, this will be a disaster to farmers, to small farmers who, need pesticides to maintain their livelihoods. But in reality, this was all prevented because of the big players that we have heard about now. You know, the same people the same 3% that own most of the land, that consolidated land, and own also most livestock, let's say, or control it. These are the same people who are happy with this intensive system with huge consequences for our environment. And then another case that is very close to people, also in Slovenia. I'm talking about this because we have had a case last week of these terrible conditions in a Slovenian poultry farm, so chicken farm. Also in Europe, we keep on hearing some positive trends. There's less and less big farms, which is true, but in reality, they're becoming bigger. They're consolidating. So even in countries like Denmark, which is a country with the largest share of animals kept in mega holdings. Mega holding is a holding with over 500 cows or over, I think, 5,000 chicken or over 1,500 pigs. So 72% of livestock in Denmark is kept in such systems. So this is not a minority system, it's a majority system. And on the whole scale of Europe, it's 31%. So again, this is not 5% of animals that are kept in such systems, but it's a third. And if you look at the other animals, how they're kept, they're in slightly smaller holdings, maybe not 500 units, but 400 units, right? 200 to 500. So again, it's not that the rest is in small farms. No, the rest is kept in slightly smaller, but still large farms. And, I mentioned before that we are seeing these trends in Eastern Europe, but in reality, we also see them in Western Europe still and still. I mentioned Denmark, where this share increased by 20% since 2005. So it already had problems with mega farms and is getting worse. And then they show us numbers that actual numbers of mega farms are decreasing, but in reality, two big farms merge. So then we have 50% less mega farms, of course, but it's becoming even a behemoth. And Slovenia is doing well, by the way, relatively. We have one of the smallest shares of animals kept in such holdings, but we import food from other countries. And this is the thing in Europe that is a bit worrying, that on one side, it's great that it's also well connected, that it's easy to get food from other European countries. It maintains food security. It ensures that if there's a drought or environmental or a climate-related disaster, like we have seen in North Italy or Catalonia or Valencia last year, it still maintains food availability across the region, but at what cost, right? And the cost for our consumers is people say it's cheap. And in reality, if we go to supermarket, we have cheap products. And we have cheap products because, on one side of this efficiency, but they try to, they try to convince us that the only way to achieve this efficiency is by maintaining the status quo of a small number of big producers controlling large swaths of land, using large amounts of pesticides, nitrogen, so fertilizers and so on. And this is the only way to maintain cheap meat, which is true, but it's not the only way to maintain food, I would say. So for me, this environmental component is very important because we always hear how difficult it is for farmers to decrease the environmental impact, to decrease emissions. And it will be difficult, but I think that in reality, these big players should also do their role. And if they would decrease it, then the small farmers would need to do less, right? So I think it's we see the two speakers before me spoke about this polarization, and we also see this polarization on the field. That we have this concentration and also concentration of environmental impacts, if we look so, right? Because if we would look at where we have this biggest concentration of mega farms, or the biggest agro food giants, this is also where we have the worst environmental conditions because of farming activities, I would say. So for me, this environmental part is very interesting to see that it's not just the socioeconomic aspects we're talking about, but it's also the environmental parts. And often one would say, to me, this is an opportunity that it's so concentrated, because it means that a few factors can make a big decision in decreasing the environmental impact. But unfortunately, it's not happening like this. A few factors maintain the status quo, which is not desirable.
Thank you, Giga. The idea that kind of stayed with me is that land concentration can be based on underperformance of the yield, maybe poor management, or maybe fear of land and profits not being fully maximized. Now we are moving on because we took some time in our first round. Before we move on with the questions, I would like to invite all the participants to pose their own questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom in the chat. And now we are diving a bit deeper into the policies. I would I would ask you to keep it a bit shorter, maybe more concise, so we have a time for a discussion also with the participants. Sylvia, moving back to you, the common agricultural policy has been criticized for supporting the ongoing trend of farmland concentration and even farmland grabbing. Could you address the way CAP subsidies, so common agricultural policy subsidies, have enabled farmland grabbing and farmland concentration, and perhaps maybe touch on potential reforms of CAP to combat these issues? The floor is yours.
Thanks. And of course, that's a very big debate, and it's a big debate at every CAP reform cycle, right? So I'm not a CAP expert either, so I will spare you from all the technical details, but I'll give what I hope are some top lines that perhaps we can center the discussion around. So first of all, I just want to bring it back to one point I made earlier, which is that the concentration in farmland in the EU has gone hand in hand with the concentration of CAP benefits. I think perhaps this is a figure that's familiar to some of you, but just to reiterate that just 80% of CAP payments go to 20% of beneficiaries. So there's a huge skew in the distribution of subsidies. And this is fundamentally due to the fact that Pillar 1 agricultural subsidies are linked to physical land size, or what's called the UAA, the utilized agricultural area, which creates a kind of direct incentive for scale enlargement, because the bigger the UAA, the more CAP subsidies one is eligible to receive. And so I'm just going to point to some long-running measures for CAP reform that have been put forward over the years by various alliances. I think the most important one that I would prioritize amongst them would be this question of capping, which is really meaning to set a ceiling on the maximum funds that any single farm can receive. There is such a ceiling in place, but a number of those that argue for more progressive CAP reform argue that this limit should be set much lower to really, break some of that monopolization of CAP subsidies. One can also encourage member states to make use of more progressive but discretionary elements of the CAP, such as the redistributive payment, young and small farmer schemes, for example, that can help to rebalance some of this skewed picture. But fundamentally, I think I would put forward that a new framework, really a new logic really needs to be proposed for the CAP in order to kind of break this connection that the biggest farmers receive the most amounts of aid. It's not fully elaborated, but some interesting visions kind of around this are something like a public money for public goods framework, that would tie farm aids to the delivery of a set of socially and environmentally relevant criteria. For example, you can relate it to things like the production of healthy food, creation of jobs, climate mitigation measures, steps to advance environmental protection and agricultural biodiversity. Some of the greening measures introduced in the most recent CAP reform through, for example, eco schemes have gone some ways to address this issue of at least the environmental sustainability, but really don't go far enough. They're still, insufficient, I would argue. And I think also one way in which the CAP is certainly not equipped to deal with this issue of farmland grabbing or farmland concentration is what I alluded to earlier, which is the issue of this financialization of agriculture. The fact that land in Europe is increasingly owned by these corporate entities or corporate farms. For example, in France, 1/3 of farms are actually owned by legal entities, by corporate entities. And here the control over farms sometimes happens simply through the transfer of shares in agricultural companies, or through other kind of complex investment webs that span multiple jurisdictions, making it very hard to know really how much land is being accumulated by any one actor. And this matters, it kind of matters to understand who the so-called beneficial owners of farm units are, so meaning the ultimate beneficiaries, because it can mean that although CAP subsidies are intended to go to active farmers, particularly those that work the land and who are actively engaged in farming activities, if we don't know who some of the beneficial owners are of these farm units, CAP subsidies can also end up lining the pockets of these kinds of investors. So one of the things, for example, it relates to CAP reform, but goes a bit beyond that, is TNI, together with a number of allies, such as, for example, the European Access to Land Network. We have been proposing the creation of an EU observatory on agricultural land that would help bring greater transparency to this question of who owns European farmland and who benefits. It would also then bring transparency into who is receiving CAP subsidies. Is it going to active farmers as intended or to other actors? And it's quite interesting to note that the creation of an EU observatory has now also, it will most likely happen. It has, for example, been recommended as one of the outcomes of this process that was convened by the President of the European Commission. She initiated a process called Strategic Dialogue on the Future of EU Agriculture. This was kind of in response to this wave of farmers' protests and the fact that the EU felt compelled to respond to this backlash, this green lash, if you will, sometimes when it comes to the prices that farmers were receiving for their products, and the fact that they were not able to always or felt that they were not able to comply with some environmental measures. This process was convened, and a series of recommendations flowed out of that, including this creation of this EU observatory. So that's one thing that TNI and together with other allies will also be working on. We will be producing a kind of policy brief on this observatory, which will be published in the next few months. It's fundamentally this question of CAP reform is always a highly contentious debate every CAP reform cycle.
Thank you, Sylvia. So what we are getting is that indeed the CAP is a driver of farmland grabbing, but right now the European Union is taking notice of this problem. And now if we move back to Katarina, Serbia has applied for European Union membership in 2009, but so far still hasn't acceded to the European Union. Nevertheless, Serbia has already made attempts at reforming its agricultural policy to better fit European Union standards. how does the integration of Serbia to European Union directly impact Serbia? And on the other hand, I'm curious what implications does this have for agricultural practices, land inequality, and farmland grabbing in Serbia? Or if I'm being more specific, I would, how did the farmers respond to the said reforms? And maybe what are the most notable forms of land grabbing in Serbia? Because we can find some form of green grabbing in Serbia. So if you could maybe elaborate on that. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I think, and it's interesting again, because there's so much conversation about CAP, but the EU intervention into member states starts a lot before the accession, because in the so-called EU negotiations, which I was often told are not actually negotiating anything, more than 50% of legislative changes that need to happen in order for a member state to become a member actually relates to the food and agriculture in the 3 chapters that relate to this. So it's a really gigantic job, a vast transformation, and it begins a lot earlier than official membership. And there's kind of 2 goals of this process. One is, of course, to make all the legislative changes that are needed for the implementation of CAP. So there's a lot of institution building, training happening, and legislative changes happening to be able to have a payment agency that is then able to participate in CAP. But the second kind of goal is actually to develop agriculture a bit, to maybe lessen the shock of joining the common market, because everyone's really aware that producers in these candidate states cannot really compete with European agriculture. And what is really interesting here for me always is that in these debates in Croatia and in Serbia, the ones that I have looked at, policymakers really want land consolidation. They don't call it concentration, they call it consolidation, but really the tiny size of parcels is always cited as a problem, because there is a so-called dual production model, which on the one hand, you have these like very large plots that used to be socialist enterprises, and on the other hand, is for them too small plots that are too dispersed. And then the goal is to kind of consolidate them and to concentrate them in a while. So it's a very like reading kind of critical policy work on this, and then policymakers is a bit of a kind of schizophrenic process sometimes, because you're reading really like different visions for agriculture. And I think I'll just try to highlight 2 ways in which this kind of consolidation or concentration happens. One is through the IPARD tool for basically, it's a fund that is for assistance that is meant to develop agriculture before joining the European Union, and it's given as basically subsidies to producers. And this was in Serbia and in Croatia. This was long awaited. It was a huge deal. It's a lot of money. But then what happens is, and it's the same as with CAP, is that who can apply for these loans and these subsidies are very large producers, actually, because you need kind of pre-financing. So even if you get a huge amount, you actually have to cover part of it before. So you need a bank loan, and then there are banks now who specialize in these loans. For even writing the project, now these applications are so complicated that you need to hire a consultant to help you. And of course, there are very few producers who actually are kind of large enough and professionalized enough to hire a consultant to write a project that might not be approved. So in a way, already before CAP even starts, there is this kind of emphasis on large producers and helping them become even larger. And then what happens with the rest? I always quote this policymaker that was in the Croatian team, actually, that negotiated with the EU before Croatia became a member state. And they use this phrase when they were talking about the too high number of farms in Croatia because they're so small. They use the phrase cleansing of statistics, so that that these kind of small farms will just be somehow cleansed out of the official statistics and improve the statistics. And this happens in two ways. Some people die. Some of these people are old people that die and who no one takes over the production. And some people actually the production fails and they have to close. And I think what is interesting is that we know very little about what happens to the land of this production that stops and to the people. And in Croatia, since Croatia has become a member, a very often cited piece of information is that more than 50% of milk producers have stopped producing. And these were usually very tiny producers with 1 to 5 cows. But for me, I myself for now haven't found any research that asked, okay, so where did these people go? What happened to these cows and what happened to this land? So there's a little bit of a mismatch between kind of these very spectacular pieces of information and then more in-depth research that would try to evaluate what is happening on a larger scale. And maybe I can touch upon the green grabbing. I think you probably mean of the lithium mining in Serbia, which is a very contested, very political process with the Rio Tinto company basically trying to build a mine on agricultural land and in Serbia. And I think this was an opportunity, I think, also to bring agricultural land to the front of the political discussion, and this has happened because a lot of the contestation was led by farmers, by producers, and a lot of the kind of arguments for defending from this investment were framed around food, around agriculture, and about the right to produce our own food. So in that way, it was an interesting change from previous land grabs, I would say, that did not do so well in media attention and attracting kind of a wider alliance of resistance. So I would stop here, but then maybe we can come back to anything that is needed.
Thank you, Katarina. And now we're moving to Giga. As agricultural land in the European Union becomes increasingly concentrated in the hands of fewer actors, and the overall farmland area continues to decrease, the European Union is still heavily reliant on outsourcing goods from the global south. And what are the implications of this farming model on global agricultural system? So besides that, also, what do you think comprehensive agricultural development strategies should cover? The floor is...
So very good question. So Europe is among the regions with it's a densely populated region with a relatively low biocapacity. This means the ability to feed itself or we don't have many resources. It's not just agriculture, also others. So we are a very resource-intensive region without any resources. And yes, if we just look at some trends, in the last 50, 60 years, the population in European Union has increased by 35%. Area of forests have increased by a quarter or a third, depending on definition. But we have up to 20% less cropland, so arable land, and 15% or so less grassland, which is, begs a question: how is this possible? And one way is, of course, triple the use of fertilizer in the last 50 years or so. But it's also basically, like you mentioned already, using land elsewhere. And the estimates of the European Environment Agency suggest, so there's no, these are estimates, that we use 60% of the European surface outside of Europe for our activities, and also 55% of water. So we're talking about land today, but water is maybe even more important in this respect. One very brazen example is we import avocados from Chile or Kenya, and the water used to irrigate them basically depletes their fresh water resources, and is then shipped to Europe where we have enough water. So it's a very interesting example. So this means obviously that we have a huge debt to the outside world, and it's because agriculture is treated as every other So the agricultural food chain is treated as every other supply chain. You know, when we talk about cars, we get car parts from or important resources from Ukraine, from Asia. We get oil from Saudi Arabia, for example. And it's basically the same in the food system. You know, we get oil from Southeast Asia, which is a very important component in our agriculture industry or food industry. We get soybeans from Brazil and Argentina, which are again very important. This is Europe is very it's heavily reliant on protein, so feed protein from other parts of the world. And the most common example is Brazil and Argentina, and the Mercosur deal will exacerbate this. Then fertilizers, we get fertilizers, you know, from Russia, from Morocco. Well, now less from Russia. So basically, every important agricultural input we get from elsewhere, and then this is just part of our food chain. You know, the chickens are, for example, in Slovenia, so the feed comes from Brazil. The part of it come from Brazil. Fertilizers come from Morocco, which are used then to grow additional feed in Slovenia. Then the chickens are fed in Slovenia and then also shipped to other parts of Europe. So basically only one part in this system, which is the only system that's really land dependent. You know, the car industry is not land dependent. It could be elsewhere. You know, other factors are more important, but agriculture really has to be where we have suitable soil, where we have suitable moisture or suitable climatic conditions. But we have still managed to decouple this land system to sometimes become landless. The animal husbandry system of Europe is the most obvious example. We actually have systems, let's say North Italy, where animals are kept, even cattle are not grazing, they're kept inside and they get feed from elsewhere. So this could happen everywhere. They don't need to be there. So it has become a landless system, which is strange. This was never the case in history. So yeah, one would say, oh, that's great. It's just hugely efficient. We can even have high livestock densities in arid areas, so we can have efficient agricultural systems in arid areas. But crises like COVID or the Arab Spring or the Russian invasion of Ukraine have shown how we suddenly become susceptible to this if our food system, because food is what we really need. Even during COVID, we worked from home. We didn't need cars so much. There were lower electricity demand, but we still needed the same amount of food. And then we have seen how exposed we are to the outside world. If we get fertilizers from someone who threatens us daily, if we get feed from an unreliable trade partner, let's say, or from somewhere where feed is being produced questionably, you know, by cutting down the Amazon rainforest and so on, or if we get other agricultural inputs or food sector inputs like oil from oil palm, which we also get from places where tropical forests are being cut, this means that our food system is not really land dependent. And if we look at, for example, statements of DG Agri in Europe, they sometimes they always defend farmers, and this is a European thing. It's, you know, taking care of our land and so on. But sometimes they forget about this, and then they post statements that the EU is has the biggest trade surplus in agriculture, in the food sector of all regions in the world. I think 50 billion euros was 2 years ago. Last year was even bigger. And then they even post numbers. We import so much food, or these resources, and we export so much. And then monetary, we have a huge surplus. But this doesn't help small farmers in Romania. It doesn't help small farmers in Slovenia. It doesn't even help small farmers in France. And this is what we have seen during these protests, right? Where or every time now the farmers are protesting the Mercosur agreement, they forget where they get most of their feed from, which is very conflicting to me. You know, they say no to Brazilian beef, but they don't say no to Brazilian soy. So yeah, we have this is what is mostly to me that yeah, we have decoupled agriculture from land, I would say, which is frightening. So sorry to be so long. One thing that the last part of your question was what to do with it. So I think this EU deforestation regulation is the right way where to go. Unfortunately, it was delayed. And to me, the really funny part of this delay is that the players that have said for 2 decades, we are not causing deforestation, are now saying, no, we have to delay it because we need to prepare that our products are really deforestation free. You were confident for 2 decades that this is not happening, and now you're saying that you have no idea where your inputs come from. So suddenly we see that they were lying to us for 2 decades, which we have known, because statistics are very clear on where we get our feed from, but no one is using it. So so it's just somewhere in Europe. So that's basically my take on this.
Thank you, Giga. And now we are moving to the Q&A part of our discussion. I would like to invite the participants again to pose their questions, but we already got a few questions. So if we start with Marcus, I've seen that Silvia has already forwarded the link to the Romanian case, but Marcus's question is, so the speakers indicate there is often a third party involved in land grabbing that is harder to track and regulate, sometimes with the aim to convert the land into other uses. What are some of the non-agricultural uses of land? And what are some of the policies or mechanisms available to protect their use as farmland? And I would maybe extend a question to maybe also farmers' protests, if you could maybe mention that. Who would like to take the floor? Maybe we start with Silvia.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, certainly, like, there are lots of combined pressures on farmlands. You know, one is this aspect of concentration, but still maintaining a although albeit intensive industrial agricultural model. But you also see that because land is of course a non-renewable resource, it's not like a commodity like any other, and so you see that it is increasingly becoming scarce, which drives up also prices of land. And so it becomes very attractive then to convert land also to acquire land and then to convert it for other uses. And that can range everything from obviously urbanization and urban encroachments, if there are not protections around, particularly around cities and towns. It can be infrastructure developments, it can be renewable energy production, it can be tourism, it can be, you know, a whole host of kind of real estate developments. You see that land has become a kind of, an attractive investment, and some of that attractiveness is also then in the conversion from agricultural to non-agricultural use. In terms of, I just wanted to point out that because the question also touched on what can be done to protect farmland or better regulate it or put it to more sustainable, to make sure it maintains some kind of sustainable agricultural use. I mean, this has been a big debate at EU level as to what extent member states can intervene in their land markets. Like, so there's one kind of more, I guess, maybe one could categorize it in fairly ideological terms, but as a more neoliberal approach, which says that the EU is governed by the internal rules of the internal markets, which just mean that investment can flow across borders, and land markets shouldn't be subject to any restrictions, because there are these kind of fundamental freedoms of cross-border mobility and investment across the EU. And therefore then it's actually not appropriate for member states to intervene in their land markets. But actually you see that and quite a few member states do actually intervene to regulate farmland, some with some more success than others, but and any kind of regulation is imperfect. But I do want to point out that there are some countries which have some bodies that try to introduce an element of social or public control over spatial planning, agricultural developments. For example, in France, there is this kind of system at departmental level across France. It's called SAFER, and they are officially combined of a kind of multi-stakeholder body that has to be notified whenever a land transaction occurs in their department, they have to have prior notification, and they can intervene if they suspect that the price of the land is excessive, so that there might be an element of speculation, or they can intervene if they consider that to promote kind of healthy agrarian structures, land should be given to agroecological farmers, for example, or new entrants, there is a way in which there's that kind of social control, public control can be introduced in farmland. Even at national level, it's sometimes assumed that land reform is kind of off the table in Europe, but Scotland just a number of years ago went through a land reform act in its parliaments, which was to really, partly in response to the fact that land in Scotland is extraordinarily concentrated. Literally 500 families control half of Scotland, Scottish land, to do with historical measures related to the enclosures and various other factors. But and there they introduced a kind of what was called a community right to buy provision, where if a community of interest is formed and they can put forward a kind of plan for development that kind of meets kind of public purpose criteria, they can even force a kind of sale in farmland to return that farmland to more kind of public or community control. So there are kind of measures by which authorities at various levels, whether it be through new national land acts or through these more regional bodies, can intervene to set some sustainability criteria when it comes to farmland regulation.
Thank you, Sylvia. Before we move on to the question from Q&A, I would maybe like to ask Katarina, because both Giga and Sylvia mentioned some alternatives or some new practices. I'm curious to know more about agricultural practices in socialist Yugoslavia. Are there maybe particular policies from that period that could be adapted or implemented today to enhance just transition?
Yes, of course. I think and it's funny because I think some of these like Yugoslav production elements are today celebrated as something very new and very, very modern. So for example, the EU's farm to fork kind of policy, which is trying to vertically integrate different parts of food production, that was kind of the basis of these Yugoslav Yugoslav enterprises, where you had, for example, in this PKB that I talked about, you had everything from growing the food for the cows to having a shop that sells the yogurt in the end. So it's a very integrated kind of controlled process. And I think today, a lot of companies are aiming for this, whereas there is already a tradition of doing this. But then I think it's also important to not just copy paste, but to really look what worked here, what didn't. And another way of organizing work through cooperatives and through different types of ownership. And I think this is something that in policy work gets maybe forgotten because we are focused on kind of what is possible in the current system, but kind of pushing the boundaries of thinking what is possible in changing our ideas of ownership and organizing labor. I think for that, the Yugoslav experience of self-management, of social ownership, of collective labor can really help. But these are then like much more abstract kind of ways of thinking, if you want.
Thank you, Katarina, and we will stay with you. Olga has a question. She would like to ask, what is the European Union stance on lithium mining on agricultural land in Serbia? And do the accession documents regarding Serbia's potential European Union membership include reference to this issue?
Okay, so the official documents do not include reference to this because they are quite broad legislative, although they do refer a lot to the rule of law. So some might argue that actually what is being endangered here is actually the rule of law, and I think if you look, for example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Serbia, some of the fights against hydropower, kind of green grabbing, have successfully used some EU legislation and EU directives in resisting these processes. But what is very particular about EU's involvement in the lithium in Serbia is that EU in general needs a lot of lithium, and it knows that it will need even more. So there is something called the Critical Raw Materials Act from the EU that is basically saying that this is now a priority. So what has been there's been a very loud silence from the EU in relation to lithium in Serbia, and I think this is something that clearly shows that the interests of the EU are now in direct opposition to the interests of people living and producing food in Serbia. So, and this is I think a very big part of this discussion, and the way that it hasn't been maybe taken to an international level more. And just on this note, I also have to mention that at the moment in Serbia, there are huge protests by the students, anti-regime, and huge student blockades that are very little reported in international media. And I know, I mean, some might accuse me of conspiracy theory thinking, but I do think that a part of this is that the regime in Serbia now is important for EU's access to lithium. So any kind of anti-regime activity is much less likely to get this kind of international support. And I would just mention in relation to the previous question as well on kind of what is another use for agricultural land. In all of the Balkans, I think we have to mention green grabbing, because it's not just mining, but it's also wind turbines, huge hydropower, not just the small hydropower that's now famous, but also very large building of very large dams and accumulations. They're all endangering agricultural land, and they're all presented as a process with no alternative. So it's a very political, but presented as a technical issue that I think we all need to work more on.
Thank you, Katerina. We have a question from Carla. What is your opinion on the potential deterrent effect of ecocide law? Should ecocide be included in the Rome Statute to be persecuted as a criminal offense by the International Criminal Court? Mass deforestation in the Amazon is often cited as an ecocide example. So we have a more environmental look at the value of land, and will anyone take this question? I'm maybe thinking about Giga.
Well, partially, like I said, we saw what are the implications of the EU deforestation regulation, which would not go as harsh as this. This is ecocide, and we have already seen what this meant for basically businesses. They were really afraid of it, not necessarily because they would be evil or doing something on purpose, but because they know how difficult it is to be fully compliant, and that they have still relied on some inputs or sources where they cannot prove where it gets from. You can see what this means. I'm not really sure if if it will have a deterrent effect, because if we look at the trends in the Amazon, for example, the EU was once the main culprit of deforestation in the Amazon due to the soy imports, and we have become more aware. Now we will require to prove that it comes from from areas with low deforestation risk. But what happens is the production is moved to those areas, or we get soya from those areas, but then soya from deforested areas goes to China, for example, which I don't think would participate in this. So this is always a problem, that it's not a fair world with and this is often what we hear from critics of any green legislation in Europe. It's rightly so, right? They say, yes, we will only punish European consumers and European businesses because the rest of the world is not doing this. And it's actually happening. But on the other side, to me, this is not an argument to just say, yeah, we don't have to do anything. I would say we have to do as best as possible. That we say, if you want to do business with us, it has to be clean, it has to follow human rights, it has to follow the high standards, not just in environment, but also anti-corruption and so on. You know, because if it's unacceptable that a business bribes politicians in Europe, it's still acceptable that the same European business bribes politicians outside Europe, let's say. And it doesn't need to be in Africa, it can be in Serbia. I think it's still the right thing to do, but also then to make it as much difficult for third parties to then engage in these activities between themselves. And I think the way is to maintain relevance and strength on the global stage, where I think Europe always thought the free trade will solve everything because we're important, everyone will trade with us. But now it seems that there's always people who are willing to trade also with lower standards, environmental standards, human rights standards, and so on. So I would say I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's black and white. And even, you know, we need to. But there is one thing that where we should do better, and this is we still are seeking for products with the lowest price, also for consumers. You know, also consumers are used to buy chicken breast for €2. And I think we're all lying to ourselves that this is a good product. It's not good in terms of environment. It's not good in terms of payments to farmers, and it's not probably even good in terms of the quality. I don't want to say food is too cheap, you know, especially not with inflation and so on. But I think we have to maybe change the food sector in terms of nutrition. Nutrition needs to be affordable, cheap, but not particular food items. Now we ensure that meat is cheap, but this doesn't mean nutrition is cheap. And it's also cheap because it doesn't consider these effects. Even if it would consider environmental impacts in Europe, it probably wouldn't consider environmental impacts in the Amazon or Indonesia or wherever the inputs come from. So this, I think, is a problem.
Thank you, Giga. Would Katarina or Silvia like to share their thoughts?
Maybe I can add just briefly, and I'm sorry because this will sound very grim, but I think in 2025, expecting much from international law is a difficult task, and I think, like with any kind of, I mean, national or international law, I think it can be a good strategic tool that can potentially be useful, but we should not hold our breath for it to be useful. Because we have also, I mean, genocide is also banned, and we have been witnessing it live on our computers for a long time now. So I would just say that, yeah, maybe expecting much from international law, maybe this is not a historical period for such hopes.
Thank you. And we have time maybe for the last question. From Daniela, and she says, my question is related to a version of green grabbing. I'm interested in the rise in prominence of conservation and regenerative agriculture in large farms. How do you see their role in land consolidation and green grabbing picture in Europe? Would anyone like to take this question?
Well, I can make a start. I'm sure others can also add, but because I very much resonated, Giga, with what you were saying about this point of decoupling, like almost like, you know, we have this idea of footloose capital, and it's not land loose agriculture, but it is an agriculture that is completely disembedded from the local kind of the kind of agricultural context in which, in terms of the kind of biophysical overrides, you know, the pushing to excess of natural limits, planetary boundaries. It's also completely disembodied from often from the local kind of social and context as well. You know, we see this kind of also rise of precarious short-term labor contracts, you know, and the substitution of seasonal migrant, sometimes migrant labor for family labor. So there's this process of like disembedding of EU agriculture from its social and ecological niches that it used to occupy. And I think that relates a bit to this issue of conservation as well, because there's this kind of fallacy as well that that if we intensify with production on the land, you know, that will then spare or save other land for natural areas, for wildlife, for environmental protection. And of course, there's a role for areas which are obviously land and forests and which are not used for agricultural production, but it doesn't take into account that there's a role for agriculture, given that so much land is also used for agriculture, that integrates, you know, biodiversity, that there's a really prominent role for agricultural diversity, that agriculture in some ways can even enhance sometimes if done correctly, and in a more, if there's a much more holistic transformation of our food production system. Yeah, EU agriculture can also go hand in hand with some forms of environmental and nature protection. Unfortunately, as you also correctly pointed out, through the role of like the agro industry, we've seen a watering down of this. Well, we saw a complete withdrawal, right, of the ban on pesticides or to have this target of halving pesticide use in EU agriculture by 2030, which was kind of one of the targets of the Green Deal. We saw a bit the watering down of the nature restoration law, even though it was passed last year. And so I think, yeah, I think there's kind of some outmoded conservation paradigms where conservation is happening presumably out there, like outside of agriculture, rather than looking at more how can conservation be integrated with agriculture. But yeah, that would require a much more thoroughgoing transformation of agriculture to support peasant agroecology or other types of more nature-friendly forms of agriculture. And then you've also seen, and this is perhaps where the large farms comes in, this question of there's this huge rise or interest in what's called carbon farming. So ways in which profits or ecological rents can be, or monetary value can be assigned to farming practices which help to sequester carbon in the soil. And of course, that in theory, like, of course, one would support like practices that don't disturb soil so much and which really keep carbon in the soils. But the concern is a bit like, given the history a bit of these kind of new markets that have been created for carbon credits, now for also biodiversity offsets, you know, all other kinds of markets that increase also the financialization of nature, like basically the question of who is benefiting from those new money markets in nature and biodiversity, and do we need to create those new markets to move towards sustainable agriculture, or can we find a way to support farmers, you know, through decent incomes that are through particularly agroecological farmers that are already doing the right things, you know, rather than creating these new kinds of, in some ways, fictitious commodities. But yeah, that's a longer running debate. Yeah.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think that what you touched on at the end is a nice way of some form of final thoughts for today's discussion. Katerina and Giga, do you have any final thoughts? Because we are nearing the end of today's webinar.
I think I spoke a lot, so
maybe I can just briefly, because what Sylvia said, and I would like this example to be my final thought because it's a positive example, and this kind of the role of agriculture in conservation. So in Croatia, there is at the moment several projects that work with grazing and pastoralism and conservation in really inspiring, positive ways, because actually extensive grazing and especially transhumant extensive grazing really help biological diversity. And there are specific species that depend on this type of raising animals. And there are several projects that bring together this kind of traditional agriculture, rural well-being and rural development and conservation. So they do exist, and I think they're a combination of looking to the past and really innovatively looking to the future. So I think this is what would be my concluding thought, is that somehow we need to bring these two together when we are thinking about new solutions. And thank you very much to Giga and Sylvia as well, and to all the questions.
Thank you, Katerina. And Giga?
No, I don't really have anything to add. I think I said enough. I'd also just like to, yeah, I agree with what Sylvia and Katerina said. And basically would like to thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for a very fruitful discussion. I also learned a lot today from the other two speakers.
Thank you. I see another question, but we sadly don't have time for it. Maybe on the next webinar, because I feel that today we've just touched the subject, and we can go much more deeper. So for final thoughts, maybe I could say that land grabbing, land concentration, land consolidation, as it was mentioned, have real social and economic consequences. And in a way, we don't have planet B, and so therefore, I think we should use natural resources sensibly and prudently, regardless of our background or identity, food is an essential aspect of our daily life. So therefore, also agriculture represents a fundamental sector where systemic change is imperative to achieve a just transition. So maybe we can start with getting educated and maybe thinking more about the food we eat, start supporting local farmers, maybe. Before we say goodbye, I would like to invite all the participants to the next webinar. It will be on the 30th of January, so in a week, at 10:30 a.m. And the topic will be just transition. Is it fair for young people? So everyone is welcome to join. And today's webinar will be posted on YouTube channel of the GreenPaths YouTube channel, and also the past webinars and the whole series will be available there. So thank you all for participating today. Thank you for a very insightful conversation. And thank you everyone who participated, and have a great rest of your day.